In this video, let's talk about how to create pivot charts from your pivot tables. And actually, you can create the pivot chart at the same time that you are creating the pivot table. So we're looking at the same data we've been playing with from the last few videos. Under Insert, we have Pivot Table, but over under the Chart section, we have Pivot Chart. Basically, you end up in the same point. Let's take a look at the difference. If I say Pivot Table, hit OK, I'm right here where I can drag my fields into rows, columns, and values. And then right up here under Tools of the Pivot Table is Pivot Chart. Right click, let's delete this. Run back over here, and this time under Insert, we'll run over to Pivot Chart. It gives us the same looking window, but it creates the chart at the same time as the table. Now notice something interesting. If the chart's selected, you're going to end up with the word legend, axis, and values. Or if you click on the pivot table, it says columns, rows, and values. So essentially the same thing. So let's just do what we've always been doing. We will take office to the rows, and just to keep it simple, we'll sum the wages, and it automatically creates the chart for us. Let me delete the chart, and once you have the pivot table created, Pivot Table Analyze, we can create a pivot chart after the fact. Now it's asking us what kind of chart do we want. We hit OK, it's the same chart. If we add additional information, so say within the office, we now add the department. The chart's going to start to get a little cluttered, but if I make it bigger, you can now see I have each office and then the corresponding departments within that office. Or maybe we want to pull the office out, and then we just have the sum of wages by department. You can chart more than one value field at a time. Let me pull off wages here. And let's put down personal days and the sick days. So this is the sum of how many personal days in this department, how many sick days in that department across here. Now, notice you have these field buttons. So if you want, you can filter your data or possibly sort the data by these things. Very often, the slicers that we've looked at previously is a better way to go. So if I click on this pivot table, analyze, I can insert a slicer or right click. Let's say I'll just put in a department as a slicer. So rather than have these buttons, very often, because they're not very flexible, you can't move them around or do much with them. When I click on the chart under, is it Format or Pivot Chart Analyze? Here we go, Field Buttons. You can hide them all, or you can right click on the field buttons and remove a particular one or hide all field buttons on the chart. So if I still only want to see like 3 departments at this point, I can choose those using the filter. Another important point about pivot charts and pivot tables is they are linked to each other and will reflect the changes you make, whether you make those changes in the chart or you make the changes in the pivot table. So for instance, I click in the pivot table, and now I want to add the office back to the rows like we've had in the past. So the chart will automatically reflect that, and there's no way to get the chart to look different or to use different data than what you're seeing in the pivot table. So for instance, if I run over here and I turn off a couple of the offices and I hit OK, well, those offices are also going to turn off in the chart, and they will always be linked. So if you want the chart to be different than the pivot table, you may have to create a second pivot table so that you can link the chart to that one and leave your original pivot table alone. The last thing I'll mention on pivot charts is basically once you've selected this chart and go to design, everything will look similar to regular charts. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here, but obviously you can choose your chart style, switch row column, your select data, change chart type, move chart if you want to put it in its own chart sheet. Adding chart elements, you can right here add legends and titles and chart titles, data tables. Everything is the same with the pivot table chart as a regular chart. You also have your format options here, and then a couple of unique pivot table items for that chart, or for that matter for the pivot table. So when you click on the pivot table, you end up with these ribbons. When you click on the pivot chart, you end up with a format, design, and an analyze for the chart. And just to review, basically 2 ways to create that pivot chart. One is under Insert. You can just start with Pivot Chart, or you can start with the pivot table, and once you have the table created under the pivot table analyze, we can create the chart at that point, which, to be honest with you, that's typically how I do it. I'll start with my pivot table, and then I'll say, okay, I want to create a chart from that. So that is it for pivot charts.